Tero Vauraste is President of Mariadi Ltd. And Vice Chair of the Arctic Economic Council and former Chair of that council as well. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Let me ask you first about the status of development in the Arctic region, and then also if you could talk about the role of the Council in that work.
Absolutely, yeah. First of all, if you have a look into what happened in May in the Arctic Council meeting, I think we entered into a new era because the security discussions have been more or less out of the scope of the Arctic Council. Now we heard the Secretary of the State, Mike Pompeo, providing a speech in the auspices of the meeting, considering Russian activities, considering Chinese activities, and especially in terms of the security issues. So, and mainly due of the different types of aspects in terms of the environmental developments, the Council was for the first time ever unable to come up with a joint declaration, which was not good. But however, there was a good meeting, and there were good progress being made in terms of the different types of activities required for the forthcoming period or the ongoing period for the Icelandic chairmanship. Yes.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the Arctic Economic Council's work has also been very productive throughout the past 3-4 years, and we've been able to gain new membership. We have more than 50 members, and we have provided new reports in terms of the Arctic economic development, and the Council has really put up their status and raised the bar in terms of working with the Arctic Investment Protocol for really sustainable investments.
What were the stumbling blocks to coming to a joint statement?
I think the main issue was the concept of climate change and the wording of climate change, and perhaps some other issues concerning climate issues and environmental issues. Those were the main blocks.
Is the U.S. the major barrier there, the unwillingness of this presidency to acknowledge climate change?
Well, we had 7 nations saying yes to the declaration and the United States saying no, so you can say that yes, it was the U.S.
How do you deal with that when you have a player as significant as the U.S. who is now put itself a bit on an island when it comes to this dynamic question?
I think the most important issue is to continue dialogue, since the Arctic Council has always been a fora for a great dialogue. Since its very beginning, it's known for being in the spirit of the Rovaniemi process, and I think the spirit still is there, and we have to maintain that spirit in order to make sure that the Council can work effectively in the future. Luckily, this lack of the declaration doesn't harm the working groups, it doesn't harm the real work of the Council. It's an issue in political terms, and you could say that now the global security issues enter the Arctic fora.
What are some of the specific security concerns? You know, we hear people talk generally about security issues. What are some of the specific concerns?
Well, I think one route, of course, is the Crimea. And what happened in Crimea is affecting the business as well because of the sanctions. But actually, I think that the sanctions are really working a bit counterwise in terms of having a look what Russia is doing now. So they are becoming more and more independent and doing businesses which they conducted before with other nations. So actually, perhaps it's working vice versa. And if you have a look into the other issues which there are in terms of the political developments, the new types of activities in Russian Arctic, the activities of China, maybe those are also some sort of a sign. But yet again, we have to bear in mind the fact that about 20% of Russia's GDP is coming from the Arctic areas. US GDP in terms of Alaska is marginal. China has no Arctic areas at all. So yet again, we also have to remember that the Arctic for Russia is totally different compared to any other nation.
Most of the Arctic experts I've interviewed over the past several years have stressed that this has been a region of the world that has been characterized mostly by cooperation versus conflict or competition. Is that still the case, or are the scales starting to shift?
I think that is still the case, and in terms of having the dialogue of Arctic-specific issues, there is good dialogue ongoing, and even though, for instance, there are sanctions between the EU, nations as well as Russia. It's a selection and it's a choice, whereas the Arctic dialogue is still ongoing. We had the summit in Helsinki a while ago between President Trump and President Putin, and as you're aware, President of Finland, Mr. Sauli Niinistö, has declared that they are, or he's willing to organize an Arctic summit, even though Finland is not anymore the chairing country of the Arctic Council, but that doesn't mean that we're going to still organize the summit, so the bid is there.
So, and you mentioned investment earlier. What does the investment picture look like now? Is it robust?
Well, in 2015, the World Economic Forum, in conjunction with the Guggenheim partners, made this report where it was considered that it's around $1 trillion potential, which is lying in the Arctic areas. We're all aware of the oil and gas potential and the mineral potentials, but bearing in mind the fact that actually the only place where offshore oil and gas drilling is taking place for the moment is Russian areas and Norwegian areas. There's nothing happening in North America, and I'm not expecting that it'll happen anytime soon. However, minerals, another opportunity in Greenland, which is of high significance. But you also have to bear in mind that whatever you do in the Arctic has always effects, and you need a holistic approach. Energy is another important area of tidal energy and of wave energy and of solar energy, renewables. So that is something that has to be taken into account as well. You have a look into tourism. The number of tourists has close to tripled in Iceland in 10 years. The tourism in Lapland, Finland has increased by 25% within the past 3 years. So definitely there's great opportunity for businesses.
What is what are the infrastructure needs around this potential for increased activity in all these areas?
Well, of course, the basic infrastructure is in two issues. It's telecommunications, and then it's ports, airports, and the infrastructure which is required for transportation. The telecommunications infrastructure is actually moving along quite nicely. There is an important initiative of setting a cable under the Northern Sea route from Europe to Asia, which would improve the speed of data, which would of course be of benefit for both ends. And yet again, port infrastructure, we're full aware that there is no deep sea port in Alaska. That is something which is really required. Now we're going to have one port finally in Iqaluit, Canada. So that's actually the first one in this area. But I recall when the Finnish icebreakers, the Nordica and the Fennica, transited the Northwest Passage, they started from Vancouver and ended up in Nuuk, and there was no port call in the meantime.
Public-private partnerships have been a buzz term and a strategy for investment in recent times. Is that the case in the Arctic?
Absolutely. So you know the fact that there is only 4 million people living in the Arctic, which means that there aren't that many taxpayers in the Arctic. So definitely, if you look into the scales which is required for the investments, we need public-private partnerships because there aren't that many taxpayers who can provide the money required for the investments.
Final question, Tero, about the symposium that we're both attending. What are your takeaways so far? How has it been going?
Well, the first takeaway is the notion which we discussed already earlier, the security talks. And I think it's important that we talk. This was actually my approach before this talk started, because you don't face a problem by not talking about it. And we heard what the Finnish minister was saying, that you cannot put a do not disturb sign on the door of the Arctic. And I hope that we don't put a sign, please make up my room, to the door of the Arctic. So we have to make up ourselves as well. So that's the first notion. Then I think the second notion is that it's great that we have such an event which gains attendance in DC. If you consider that Wilson Center or some other organization would have organized this type of an event 5 or 10 years ago, I think maybe we would have had 20 or 30 or 40 people in the room. Now we have hundreds of people in the room. And I think it's also great, so let me quote Senator Lisa Murkowski from a couple of years back from an event in the Wilson Center, and she was saying, everybody, good morning, nice to see you all in this Arctic conference. And actually, I would like to see new faces in an Arctic conference. not familiar to me. And this happened today, so I'm thankful for that.
Great. Well, and glad to have the veteran faces around as well. Tero Vauraste, thank you for joining us for the conference and for this interview.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.